Hi, I'm Greg Farrar. It's August 11th, 2020, and this is my COVID-19 Trends live stream. We will cover the countries of the world. Normally I would start us on this page, just the front page of my website, gregfarrar.us. You can go to this website yourself if you ever want to look at any of the graphs I'm looking at. All I really do here is go through the graphs that you can go through, but I do go through having seen them a whole lot and having a very good gut sense of what's bad, what's good, what tends to happen when certain other things happen, and so on. Nevertheless, the data is there for you to look at it based on publicly available sources like COVID Tracker and Our World in Data. And I do three analyses of the countries of the world, the states of the United States, and the counties of California. I think I'm going to do a sort of lightning round just through the three levels of severity graph, just so we can kind of get a sense of how there's a broad trend across the whole world that is somewhat replicating in the states and in California, which is a downward trend. We've been seeing this for a long time now, but quickly looking at just the severities of the world, of the countries, we see that all the really bad stuff is behind us at this point. There may be bad stuff to come, but at this point, we're lower than we have been on the whole. And severity of almost all countries, these are the 20 worst countries in severity being a combination of daily cases per million people and the growth rate. So it's a metric that combines those two, how fast something is changing as well as how large it actually is compared to the size of the country. In severity, I consider 200 to be severe, a hot spot, very severe. There are only 4 countries now that are doing it above the 200 level, only 4 severity hotspots. As you can see, if you look back, there have been quite a few others in the past, but right now we've only got 4, and none of them are remotely as bad as some of the ones that we've seen, like Bahrain and Qatar, which is now actually rolled off the graph entirely. Those few that reached into the near the level of 800 in severity or 1,000 in severity, those are history. Whether we'll see some again is anyone's guess, but my guess is we won't. My guess is we're not going to see things like this again, 600s and thousands, that we're generally going to see countries dropping. That said, looking at the countries as a whole, it's not really clear that they're dropping right now in the short term. These 3 of the 4 worst ones are rising: Peru, Panama, and Brazil. Well, Brazil's dropping, but the other 3 are rising: Panama and Colombia. Brazil is slightly dropping now, but the rest of them are not even hot. Even though they're the hottest in the world, they're not hot. They're only warm spots, and some of them aren't even that. Now, let's flip over to the states just for comparison. We don't normally do this, but take a brief tour to the states, and we'll be back to the countries for a more in-depth look later. Soon, actually. Briefly, you see the states are doing something like this, where recently we had things in the 600s and 800s and 500s, quite a lot of them actually. The states were a lot worse than the countries, really. We had a whole lot of very hard-hit states and relatively few really hard-hit countries. But those, even more than the countries, seem to be declining. There are very few states that are showing a rise in severity. 2 exceptions are, okay, I don't usually count the territories because they swing wildly, but if we were going to believe the numbers they have, the Virgin Islands are low but rising and might actually become severe. Hawaii, though, is definitely real and has been rising steadily and is now very severe, and so that's the exception. But all the rest, as you can see, are dropping. We still have a lot of severity among the states, unlike the countries where there are really only 4 severity hotspots. We have maybe 10 state severity hotspots, but mostly those are dropping. Again, we'll see in our later segment devoted to the states what that really looks like. I'm going to zoom out for a minute. These are the counties. In the counties, we've had some really wild numbers. Now and then we have Kings and Imperial, which were really, really high back in the day, well over 1,000 in severity, well over 2,000 in the case of Imperial. And we've had a few odd spikes for Stanislaus and Kern, which recovered so quickly that I don't quite believe that they were anything but even maybe misentry of a single day of data. I try to correct to some degree for that, but so maybe there really were extraordinary spikes there. But in any case, if there were, here's Stanislaus now no longer a hot spot. And here's Kern dropping so quickly that it seems likely that it will drop below hotspot territory in the next week or so, but right now it is still the worst county according to this graph. And then we have some of these other ones. Some of them don't have the very most recent data, but certainly among the counties, again, we see quite a lot of severity hotspots, but generally the trend is downward. There are very few counties that are rising, where the severity is growing as we get closer and closer to today. So that's the trend we see. Countries, states, and cities, especially states and counties, there's a real trend towards recovery. Country is a little harder to say. Certainly the big picture here is for the past month or so, we've seen nothing over 400. And for the month before that, we saw several countries that were over 400. But on the other hand, we do still have a fair bit of severity happening in certain hotspot places. The United States, however, is not one of them. So now I'm going back to the countries to focus on them. We'll look at the United States briefly, just to note that it continues. It did peak. It did peak around July 20th. That's when I wrote that Medium article that says the United States is peaking, and then made some more controversial claims about whether it would unpeak in the future. I don't think it will. But it certainly, undeniably did peak at that time and has been heading very steadily downward. You can't get a line much straighter than that. So here you have the United States having been well into severity hotspot territory, now recovering, and now down to 150, which puts it in mid-warm spot territory, doing better than some countries certainly, and certainly better than it has done in the past. Brazil, by the way, actually let's just take a look. Brazil fooled me with that peak. I think that was the peak it fooled me with, or maybe it was this one where I said, Brazil's peaking, and it was, but not permanently. So will that happen in the United States? We'll see. Again, Brazil seems to have peaked, but as we can see, it's also doing kind of a rising sawtooth pattern, so we don't really know what's going to happen with Brazil. Long term, it will peak, but is this the actual top of the peak? We'll see. If we look at various countries of Central South America, I'll try to catch them all, but I will not necessarily do so. We see there's just a lot of trouble in Central South America right now. And let's throw in the United States while we're at it, because it kind of fits in, really. The United States, though, is showing a downward trend. It's this slightly darker green. It looks like it's peaked. And if you look at all its components, all the states, as we will next time, as we actually just did, they've almost all peaked. And so it seems likely that the United States will go down as all the states do, assuming we keep doing the things we're doing that have helped control the epidemic. Big assumption. So the United States peaked. Central South America, which really was better than the United States, at least at this point, and through much of July. The United States was one of the worst. We still had Panama really standing out there, but of the largest Central South America countries, they were doing poorly but better than the United States. It seems like we're switching places. The United States it seems to be headed downward. It looks like it might not even be warm in a few more weeks, whereas at least some of Central South America, broadly it's been rising, and some of them are still rising, even in the very short term, those three I mentioned, whereas the rest of them arguably could be said to be showing a short-term decline. We'll see what actually happens there, but still, when you look at the top 20 most severe countries, most of them are the Americas, or half maybe, are in the Americas. And top 4, if in Bahrain was such a problem, but is clearly getting better, or has been. if you throw out Bahrain, it's the top, what is that, 7 almost, are all Central South America. There's a real overrepresentation. We don't see China here. We don't see anything in Asia. You see anything in Asia? A little bit in the Middle East. Some representation in Africa. But Asia seems to be over it and seems to be staying there, along with Australia, by the way. Because I may again go into this. Maybe I'll just take a moment here to go into it. This narrative that we're seeing second waves in Japan or in Australia. Not so. Not many definition of wave that I would consider reasonable anyway. Let's look though at just one component of the severity, which is the growth. What direction is the growth rate heading for the hottest countries, the ones with the most daily cases per million? We've seen definitely, if you look farther back here on this graph, we're seeing a general downward trend of growth rates. We used to have lots of 40s and 50s and 60s, and some even pushing 100% weekly growth. But that doesn't happen anymore. We only have 30 at the top, but that's still a substantial growth rate. I do think, though, that if you look at this graph, it seems like the worst countries are holding steady in growth rate right now in the short term. The worst hit countries do not seem to be getting better in their growth rate. The United States is certainly an exception to that. I can flash that number for a minute. We can see the United States again shows this very solid, steady downward trajectory. But other countries, the other worst hit ones, well, it's worth noting that a lot of these are shrinking. The growth rates, they're steady, but they're negative steady, which is great. Holding steady at negative 10% is great. That will shrink you to nothing in a few weeks, a few months. But the ones up here, like just to pick out one at random, Bosnia Herzegovina, we have, that's a pretty horizontal line we've got here. We saw what seemed to be a recovery, and now they've plateaued in their recovery. Now at 14% weekly growth rate, that's not terrible, but it's got to get below 0 before they can be considered to actually be recovering. Here's our Qatar, by the way, which was by far our worst country, now by far the best. It is long since bottomed out. It's been shrinking and shrinking, and now Qatar just doesn't have a problem anymore. Brazil in growth rate, this is another way of looking at the wave we saw. It can't decide whether to recover or not. Right now it's looking pretty good. Weekly growth at only 3%, pretty good, but it was there before, and then it lost it. So it could happen in the United States. It could be that we're going to turn right back upwards again. Schools are opening. Maybe that'll be a terrible disaster. Maybe people get tired of wearing masks and socially distancing, and we'll start to see a rise. Maybe the testing delays and in some cases outright failures to record test results that we're seeing in California, maybe those will catch up to us, and it'll turn out that these graphs of daily cases were wrong. They are wrong in California, by the way, because we know that they haven't recorded all the cases because of computer problems. Nevertheless, when I look at the total numbers that have failed to record, it doesn't look to me like it's going to change the general trend. The general trend, I think, would still be downward, even if we'd had those tests successfully recorded, but it wouldn't be as sharply downward as what we see here. All right. I do want to take a moment again. These are the growth rates of all the countries. A terrible snarl, but it's nice if you ever want to look at this stuff yourself. gregferrar.us. You can go check out something like, say, to pick a country completely at random, Japan. So if you look at Japan, not actually selected at random, you'll hear things in the news that say, oh, Japan is having a terrible new second wave. Australia as well. I've mentioned this before, but I want to bring it back here again because it's just not true. So Japan in some sense, sure, Japan had a terrible wave, or Australia. Look at that, 150% growth rate week over week, 150%. And here we were just talking about how 40 is bad and we never see 40 anymore. There it is at 150%. And there's Japan at 75%. Now, you can see, first of all, Australia has quickly gotten over that, but let's just pretend we were back on July 11th. The question is, how bad does Australia have it? Now, you saw that I have a severities graph, and you would think that a country with 150% weekly growth rate, astronomical growth, would show up as on my severities graph as one of the worst. So why doesn't it? Well, let's look at the other component of severity. Australia did have 150% growth, but what was its daily cases per million? Daily cases per million for Australia, work with me here, graphs, work with me. Okay, it's just suddenly frozen. There are a lot of dots on these graphs. Sometimes they have trouble. I wonder if it's going to, okay, now it's coming back to me. Australia, double click, okay. So, back in, what was it? What were we looking at? What date? Mid-July, let's say, for both of them really, when we were starting to get what I would call alarmist stories, well-meaning stories, but I think alarmist, about Japan and Australia. Back in the day, mid-July, is when we were starting to see these things happening. We were starting to see the growth rate rising of Australia, for instance. So let's throw in Japan while we're at it. So look at that, the growth rate's rising. Isn't that terrible? However, compare this for a moment to, say, the United States. The nice thing about this graph is it adjusts for population. So Australia rose, and at that point it was around 10 when we were starting to really see the stories. Now it's as high as 20 in daily cases per million. Japan was around 5 and now is as high as 10 in daily cases per million. So how does that compare? So here's the United States. Not the worst hit of the world, though pretty bad. A fairly good example of a relatively hard hit country in daily cases per million. And the United States, as you can see, it just dwarfs anything that Australia and Japan have ever seen. You can call this a wave if you want, when they went up to 13. Certainly it went from 0 to 13 and back down, so you could call this a wave, but I wouldn't. I'd call it a ripple. And I'd say they had a little bit of a ripple again. Now maybe this is going to come back, or maybe it's going to keep rising. Maybe this is going to keep rising. Maybe it'll hit U.S. levels. But if you look at the slope of how quickly this rose, these two countries have nothing going on in COVID land. It's great. They have nothing going on. Lucky them. And they can crack down and they can lock down. And I think that's a great idea so that they can get it back to 0 as they did. And if it comes back, they can do what they're doing again and crack down and lock down, and it'll get back to 0. But these are not waves in the sense that I'm talking about. These are insubstantial, insignificant waves of COVID-19, and I just don't think they should be in the news. I will be a little bit interested to see how quickly they get over this, because my theory is they'll probably peak, and you maybe start to see this in Australia right now, a little bit of a downturn there. We may see Australia peak, but it's awfully soon to say. Don't really know. If they do go to 100, then I'll start paying attention, maybe even at 50, but at 10 and 20, these are just not news. They've still got it great, and with such a low percentage of the population infected, they have the real possibility of testing and contact tracing their way out of it, which is what they're doing right now, and locking down and wearing masks and all the things that everybody's doing nowadays. So I think that's enough on the countries. Let's move to the states of the United States. I've already shown this graph. Notable is Hawaii. In my Medium article, where I made some speculative claims, one of those claims was that Hawaii, along with 4 other states, I forget which ones they were, maybe Maine was one of them. There were 4 smallish states Hawaii would join in with the other four in a final wave. We had a wave in April of some states. We had a wave in May of some other states. We had a wave in June and July of some other states. And now, finally, we've burned out all of our states. They're all kind of done. They've all pretty much peaked. They're now declining. The speculation I make is that they're not going to come back in the medium term. We're not going to have waves like this again on any of these states. That once a state has a wave, it never has another wave of that size, or at least not in the medium term. And by medium term, I mean 3 to 6 months. And by then, we'll have a vaccine. And at that point, that will keep us from having what would surely happen, almost surely happen, as a second wave. It's worth noting, though, that the SARS epidemic did have a very small wave, I'd call it a ripple, and then got stomped out and really never has come back, as far as I've been able to determine. So it's not always true. I get a lot of pushback on this. There won't be a second wave thesis from people who say, well, look at this epidemic, look at that epidemic, look at, in particular, the 1918 flu epidemic. And to that I say the 1918 flu epidemic was pre-vaccine. And COVID would very likely progress similarly, though there was all sorts of interesting stuff happening there with military, the World War I and all the people in camps in Europe getting it and bringing it back, and things that aren't happening with COVID. That might make its trajectory different. But I do believe COVID would have a second substantial wave 6, 12, 24 months from now if it weren't for vaccination. But I also believe that vaccination very likely will succeed. We will get a vaccine. I believe that people will take it because they're afraid. That's why all this has happened. All the mitigating factors have been driven by the fear of the population. And that's what's gotten us out of this. And that fear will continue to serve us well, I think, in driving people to vaccinate themselves and their children. Not 100%. I recognize there are a lot of people who are not fans of vaccine in any form, but fortunately, I would say those are a minority, and we'll get enough vaccination to manufacture our own version of herd immunity. So that's why there's not going to be a second wave. But Hawaii here is anyway behaving very nicely along with my thesis, having a wave, its own wave. And I forget what the other three were. I got to look those up. But the other states you can see are all declining. There's one here. Oh, that's right, the Virgin Islands, which fluctuates wildly. It's small. The numbers are small, and that allows things to move up and down a lot. So I tend to ignore the territories. And I tend to ignore the territories. Puerto Rico also here as one of the territories, but it's severe and actually behaving much like one of the other states. But we'll see what happens with the Virgin Islands. If they do continue to rise like this, they certainly had a real problem before, and they don't seem to have gotten over it. If they do continue to rise like that, then they'll be back in our news. But big picture here is one of declining numbers for weeks now. Steady decline for weeks of all states in severity. Let's look at the growth. We looked at this for the countries as well. Growth typically looks even better usually than severity. And I won't get into why that is mathematically, I don't think, but suffice it to say that since severity includes the rising of cases, even while the growth is dropping, well, I just got into it mathematically. Anyway, the growth for the states is looking, I would say, great. It's just looking great. A month ago, I had nothing good to say about this graph. It was just horrible. You can see this miserable cluster on the left where every state, in fact, there was a time where every one of these 20 states were growing. They were all above the zero line. Now, almost all of them are shrinking. And the very few, the 4 that aren't shrinking, 3 of those are rapidly headed below zero. So their growth rates are shrinking, even though their growth is still slightly positive. They're still seeing slightly more cases every day. But there's just an absolute rope here trending downward. All the states, all these worst hit states are moving pretty much in lockstep. The only possible exception is Puerto Rico. Again, the territories tend to be more extreme, but even it broadly seems to be showing a decline. So the growth is looking great. Let me look at something I haven't looked at much recently. Is one of my classic graphs, the daily cases per million graph. See, this is why this gets included in severity, is because things look much worse if you look at this graph. You look at that growth graph, you'd think, wow, we're done. We've dropped below 0. But let me tell you, we are not done. Here's the 100 mark. 100 in daily cases per million is enough to make something a DCPM warm spot in my definition, and 200 makes it a hot spot. And there are just a ton of states that are still pretty warm and pretty hot in the number of cases they're seeing every day. Now you can see almost all of them trending downward. That's because their growth rates are negative. As we saw, the growth rate is negative, and that will cause these to turn downward when the growth rate goes negative. There are a few exceptions. Who's this? Hawaii. Yeah, Hawaii really breaking free of the pack and affirmatively rising. There's just about no one else that's doing that. Maybe some of these little ones, once you get down into the teens or the below 50 or so in DCPM, there can be fluctuation up and down because it just kind of stays there for a while. Really, I think it stays there until the whole world has licked this thing, because there are always going to be new people coming from another hard-hit state, coming from, for instance, Florida. Very hard hit, though looking much better. Arizona, very hard hit, they're looking much better. Arizona is actually going to drop out of hotspot territory in a matter of days. And then a whole lot of these other ones, this May and June wave, peaked in late June, trending downward. All these are going to take their time to drop into warm spot territory. Just to pick one, for instance, South Carolina, one of the what we used to call the Gang of Six, those 6 hardest hit states from, when was it? I guess that was also, that's July. I would have thought that I think the Gang of Six was starting to turn southward. Yeah, I guess that kind of makes sense. I would have thought the peak was earlier. But in any case, I was probably using my rope chart graph with the blue background back then. When you get this more granular graph, South Carolina didn't peak until July 21st. It's been heading steadily downward, but it's still at 270. So South Carolina still has a terrible problem. They're doing something. Something's happening here, and I don't think it's the progression of the disease. It's not herd immunity. It's actions being taken by individuals, actions being taken by the government that turned the corner and brought it downward. And so as long as they continue to take those actions, the trend will continue downward. But at this rate, I mean, where would that be? It's months from now that they actually get all the way down to 100 or to 0 or to 100. Couple months maybe. So there are a lot of states like this. When you look at this graph, there are a lot of states that, though they're getting better, they're still very sick. And so I'll just say it again. We've got to keep doing the things that got us here, the things that turned that corner. The good news is we can now start to guess when we might be able to lift restrictions. You look at something like New York. Is this New York? Yeah. New York was poster child for COVID, had it terribly badly, and they did the things. They had a severe lockdown. In a matter of weeks, they peaked and turned the corner, peaked very high, 450. They had one of the worst that we've seen in the United States in daily cases per million. But they kept doing the things, and they're still doing the things to some degree, but starting around here, the governor started saying, okay, things are actually looking good. We can start to, we still have 33 cases per million, but many of them I think are imports. I don't know that for sure. That's what happens it's been happening in New Zealand, I think. New Zealand has cases, but it doesn't make its own cases. Its cases all come from outside. There's no community spread in New Zealand. And I don't think we've gotten that place in New York, but I wouldn't be surprised, given what a hub New York is of business and other things, if most of these cases aren't imported at this point, if they're coming from Arizona or Florida. And so New York can probably just never drive that number any lower than this. until the rest of the country recovers. But they've done very well, considering what a mess the rest of the country is, to manage to level out and stay near zero. But again, the country is a mess. We have, I don't know, 40, 30 states, 25 at least, that are warm spots or hot spots in daily cases per million. And though the news is good, as you can see, they're shrinking, most of them. It's still weeks and weeks, months probably, before we can even begin to relax whatever it is they're doing to make that curve drop. All right. I will look at deaths, because deaths are interesting these days. For a long time I didn't pay attention to deaths because they weren't interesting. They just followed cases too closely, but they don't follow cases anymore. Nowadays, we can see this here. What is this? Arizona. Arizona really recovering well. And it recovered before some of the others, so you can start to see its deaths dropping. For the most part, deaths are rising. And I think it's because these states peaked 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it takes some time to catch up. Assuming we actually have we know of all the cases, assuming we know all cases, big assumption, we can expect the deaths to be at whatever percentage they are now of mortality, 0.5% mortality rate or something, but we can expect those to follow often much later than certainly after you die, after you get infected. You also die after you get hospitalized. You die after you go to the ICU. You go to the get intubated, and then you die in those few cases. And at each, it's a funnel. At each stage, you have fewer and fewer people moving to that stage, but each stage can take days or weeks, and so you have this funnel where the recognition of the case, which is what we've been showing in these other graphs. The recognition of the case is the very first thing that happens. And in those few unfortunates, the death is the last thing that happens, and it happens so many weeks later. And so deaths will tend to lag. They will be a lagging indicator of cases. So we can see Arizona doing that. Someone's going kind of wild here. Texas, which has been very bad in deaths, has a sudden downward spike of deaths. Not quite sure I believe that. It's short term. We'll keep an eye on it. But almost everyone else is rising still in deaths. Here's someone else who isn't. Alabama, another one of the gang of 6. One of the ones that got over it early. So do we have this graph is only fairly recent data, so we probably don't have anything interesting about New York, but I'm a little curious. How did New York? Yeah, New York, it just doesn't have any deaths. Very few deaths. 0.3 of a death per million people. Compare that with 10 for Mississippi. Mississippi, by the way, keeps being a real challenge. It's part of this latest wave, but it is not showing as much recovery as we've seen elsewhere. Let's see if we can find it here. I'm guessing it'll be one of these. Well, no, actually. Mississippi is finally doing better. It had a long, sustained positive growth period where it was looking like one of the worst states, but Mississippi, like almost all of the states, all the worst states, has turned the corner. And by the way, if we look at all the states, not just the worst ones, and territories, we can see that the vast majority have turned the corner and are shrinking. There are Hawaii. Hawaii is in its own new wave, and it's a very severe wave. It's as bad as really any of these others. Yeah, I'm not seeing like where is how does Hawaii compare to Arizona? Can't even find Arizona. Arizona and Hawaii. Yeah, it doesn't go far enough back for us to see Arizona before when it was really high. Arizona might have been this high, but 100% plus week over week growth in cases is extraordinary. So Hawaii is having a real problem. All that they did to try to lock out the tourists just seems to have delayed the inevitable. All the states have gotten it, and eventually Hawaii did too. But maybe it's leveling out. Seems like it might be. Maybe its wave is coming to an end. Maybe I'll look briefly at testing. Haven't looked at that for a bit. And I know why now, because testing graph is such a mess. Testing is really only useful when we look at it for a particular state. So let's just look at testing for a few not so randomly chosen states. These are the ones that I tend to pick out because I know people who live there, and the people who watch my stream tend to be people I know, or at least secondhand know. So that may not be all of them, but just to take a sampling of just a few states. Testing rates, test positivity rates, number of tests that come back positive of under 8% is good. We'll throw in New York here too, just to get a sense of what success looks like. Under 8% is good. New York is now under 1%. Less than 1% of the people they test come back positive. They don't have many cases, and they're still testing like gangbusters. But no one else is really there, at least among my friends and family list. Texas is doing very poorly at 20. It seems to have suddenly spiked. Arizona, at least, though it was up almost at 30, its testing rate is dropping, which is great. Great news. As I sometimes say, testing creates an upper bound on how many cases, what percentage cases you could have in a state. If only 15% of your tests are coming back positive, you couldn't possibly have more than 15% positive in the state. I mean, it's mathematically possible, but the odds are infinitesimal, because the people who get tested tend to be the people who are more likely to have the virus. And so when you see something like this with New York at 1%, you can be darn sure that less than 1% of New York is currently infected. In fact, it's probably much lower. And with Georgia here at 12%, these aren't good numbers, but Georgia also dropping, Ohio also dropping. It looks like Colorado, maybe, like all of these may be dropping just a little bit. California truly can't be trusted right now because of its testing reporting problems. But Louisiana, Colorado, they're flat. They're below 8% already, so they're in reasonably good territory with their testing percentages. And they seem to be possibly even dropping. So there's just a smattering of testing data. Again, if you want to see your own state, come to gregferrar.us, check it out. I do seem to actually, well, I don't really have extra time. Never mind. I'll move on to the counties. Make sure we're reasonably up to date. The counties, I always lag a couple days. I've had trouble with the most recent days of county data. But we looked at this already. If you zoom out, there are some wild things that probably aren't real, but even if they are real, they've gotten better. If you zoom in, then the severity graph looks, there are two ways to look at this. In one sense, it looks terrible because there are so many severe, over 200 graphs. And everyone in the top 20 is over 100 in severity. So they're all warm spots, and most of them are hot spots. So California counties are still very hard hit, much like the states of the US. These graphs look rather similar. The good news is that all these are dropping. All of them are dropping, with essentially no exceptions. We could say that Sonoma is rising, but in the short term, even it is flat. So severity is falling in every single place in California. Is this because the computer systems aren't recording? Maybe, but again, when I don't remember now the details of my analysis, but there were 300,000 unreported tests, with California's positivity test rate. I'll just try to do the analysis real quick here. What I think we saw was 0.7 just now. That's about 21,000 new cases that would have been reported. Let's real quick head over to California COVID-19 cases. Lately I've been using Google when I don't want to use my own site. Actually, the nice thing about Google is I always adjust for population, and Google doesn't. Usually that's a problem, I think, but in this case I really want to know. What did I say, 2,100 cases? Now I've forgotten. 21,000 cases. Okay, so California sees on the order of 10,000 a day. So it's something like 2 days of cases are not in the system yet. Now California's been dropping, and it's pushing close to 5,000 a day now. So maybe it's more like 4 days of cases haven't been reported. So that doesn't explain this graph. We've seen this dropping for since August 7th, August 9th. So some of this drop is probably due to those, what is that, as much as 50% maybe of this can be attributed, the drop can be attributed to the failure of the computer system, but not all of it, I believe. That was the real back of the napkin calculation, so I could be wrong, but I did this calculation before and also convinced myself that this drop in California is not entirely attributable to that problem. It was just one testing center, as I recall, that was affected. It was a big one, but there are many tests results still coming in, so we're not just seeing the numbers drop. And I guess another way of looking at that is to say we're not seeing them drop just because they aren't being reported, is to say, what does the daily cases per million graph look like? Well, it's awfully wiggly. Hard to say what it looks like. Let's try looking at, yeah, too bad. This shows all counties. I should do one like I do in the others where I show the cases per million top 20 only. But I think this is maybe the top 20 here really are the top 20 overall. All right, my graphs are not letting me click again. All right, I'm not going to spend time on it, but we can look at Imperial briefly, just for old time's sake. Remember Imperial at 1,000 DCPM, one of the worst places in the world we've ever seen, and now it's down to 250. Still, even after all this recovery, still showing a severe, still a severity hotspot. But as we can see, it's very reasonable to expect that it will continue downward and will not be a severity hotspot for much longer. Let's look at the growth. This is the kind of the leading indicator of that other one. Which direction are we headed? If Kern and Stanislaus did those weird spikes, they may have been real, they may have been data anomalies. Either way, they've recovered. Right now, we have no similar spikes happening. The worst, very worst growth rate we have of any of the top 20 counties, the top 20 counties in total cases, is under 20%. Recall that 40 is bad, 20 is is not great, but 20 is nothing to be really worried about historically speaking when we compare it to some of the numbers we've seen. Recall that Hawaii right now is over 100% weekly growth. So the very worst is Sonoma. Notice that it's turning downward though. It's got a slight downward trend. And notice that it's probably the worst, or the slightest of the downward trends. Every other county of the hardest hit counties is trending downward in growth rate, and as with the states, many of them have crossed zero. All these counties are shrinking in daily cases. If we had looked at them in the graph, I'll just pick one. Let's look at what does it look like for how about one that's done a little sooner so we can have it give it a chance. Here's a nice slow decline for Marin County. So Marin County is shrinking. Do we have Marin here? No, that's the trajectories graph. And so this is what it looks like on that graph when we flip back to the other one briefly. Marin, everyone's doing this. All of the counties are doing this. All the worst hit ones at least. Somewhere around July 30th, its growth rate dropped to zero, right around the turn of the month, and it's just been heading downward in a very straight line. Now you see what happens here. When you do that, then somewhere around July 30th, you have a zero growth and it starts to trend downward. This is what it means. This is how we know that its growth is negative, is because each day we have fewer cases than the day before, or each week. Or in this case, it's a 2-week average. It's a 14-day average. So that's Marin, but all the counties are roughly following this pattern. Not all at quite the same time. For instance, well, let's look at another one. Here's San Benito. San Benito is still growing, but right now it's crossing that zero line. This is right around the point where Marin was at the middle of the day, or at the beginning of the month rather. You wouldn't know it from looking at this actually. From this I would say that it's kind of clearly already peaked, but maybe because this wiggle it has this long-term wiggly plateau. In any case, only now is the graph saying that it actually is heading downward. And so we have what's a wiggly plateau, but we will see in the weeks to come, if that growth graph continues, that San Benito will start to see fewer and fewer cases. Right now it's barely a DCPM hotspot, has a lot of cases. All these, like the States, there are a lot of problem hotspots here still. But we see this leading indicator saying we're just about at the peak. And to say it again for the millionth time, being at the peak and seeing that your growth is dropping and seeing that your line is declining does not mean that it's time to go party or do anything differently. We get to the peak by doing all the things, by wearing masks, by staying indoors as much as we can, with our what do you call it, quarantine, by hanging out with just your quarantine, by not mixing with a lot of people, by socially distancing when you have to. All those things, and by shutting down businesses and schools and whatever else needs to be shut to encourage that as much as possible. That's why we've peaked these counties, is all the things that California and the counties and the people of California have done. That's why these have peaked, I believe. I will say this isn't clearly shown by the data, so that's debatable, but that's my belief, is that is the reason for this. What I mostly show is just the trends, but why else would it have peaked? I want to know. I don't think the disease naturally peaks until it infects 70% of the population. So this isn't a natural peak, this is an artificial peak, and I have all those theories about why the peak happened. So just because San Benito is hitting zero, all it means is we're halfway there. The peak is halfway there. There's the whole downslope still to hang in there, keep doing the things, and once you get down to near zero in DCPM, not just in growth, that's when you can start to party cautiously. And once you're vaccinated, then you can really party. All right. I think I'll end there. I actually did it in about my 45 minutes, like I always intend to. Not much news, really, because the news is the same as it's always been. Everything's getting better. The United States and the counties of California are terrible, but very clearly getting better. And again, it's because of the things we've done. So keep doing those things. I'll keep telling you about the graphs, and one of these days we can all hang out together again. I'm Greg Farrar. Thanks for watching.